Plato's Cave, a Project Transhuman short story, written by J.S. Morin, narrated by Michael Naramore. That a human boy should eat popcorn while watching a movie was perhaps the most preposterous occurrence of the 31st century. Firstly, popcorn wasn't manufactured anywhere on Earth. This batch had been carefully engineered and cultivated in a laboratory setting. Second, this boy was fully grown, huge, brawny, with the muscle definition, jawline, and hair of a bodybuilder in his early 20s. Lastly, and most crucially, humanity had been officially extinct for over 1,000 years. Plato was part of a new breed. As the dead Earth had been painstakingly revitalized by the robots who'd inherited it, new species were introduced slowly, deliberately, with utmost planning and loving attention. First, algae and other microbes. Then grasses, insects, crustaceans, shrubs, vermin, trees, fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals in ever-increasing complexity. Humans were the finish line of the marathon of genetic de-extinction. But some robots couldn't wait. Eager for the accolades of being the first to successfully repopulate Earth with cloned humans, they cut corners, took risks, and the results were often too horrific to bear. The best of a bad lot, Plato suffered from chronic arthritis, and his accelerated aging promised a tragically short lifespan. But he could look after himself. Strong, quick, and clever as anything, he was 90% of the way to some mad robot's dream of a perfect human. But at 12 years old, he often acted his age. He hooted through car chases, quoted cheesy action heroes, and fast-forwarded through long stretches of exposition. "What did you think?" his host asked. Toby 22 was a stocky, bulky robot built for outdoor work. He wore overalls and dirt-crusted boots that weren't worth the trouble to clean off. As the groundskeeper for most of the British Isles, he oversaw forests replanted in grid patterns, deer that relied on deliveries of feed, and swarms of pollinating bees that needed constant replenishment. Plato swallowed. Pretty bland. That's because the salt won't stick without butter, and dairy isn't exactly a mature industry. But I meant the movie. Oh, yeah, movie heckin' rocked. Amazing, the primitive stuff my ancestors flew. But they had top-notch heroes. You getting tired? Toby 22 asked. I can make up the bed. Plato stood. Big as Toby 22 was, Plato was half a head taller and would have outweighed him if he'd also been comprised of steel and circuitry. He put a meaty hand on his friend's shoulder. Hey, I got some good news for you. He had all the subtlety of the movies he loved. Clearly, his somber tone was more indicative of his true mood. You won't have to put up with me crashing here anymore. What? Toby 22 asked, stunned. Instantly, he recalibrated his optical sensors for high data acuity. Not that he was a veterinarian, but he knew basic signs of distress in biological creatures. He knew Plato was a genetic time bomb, but he'd imagined the boy still had a decade or more left. What's wrong? He felt at Plato's neck for a pulse. Plato backed up a step and swatted away the amateur medical attention. Hey, nothing's wrong. I just got my own place, that's all. Your own? No, that's not a good idea. Not a good idea at all. Plato backed away, hands up. Hey, calling it like I see it. You've been great, but I'm a security risk for you. You wouldn't be if you came out publicly. Not happening. I see what some of your buddies get up to. No thanks. Until I get rid of the bad apples, I'm not trying the apple pie. Toby 22 smiled inwardly. The kid's metaphors were improving. Slightly. At least give it some thought. There's more to being out on your own than a roof over your head. Plato gave a glance all around. The popcorn had left a mess on the floor. So had his dinner of synthetic bear kibble. I'll help clean up, but I plan on sleeping in my own bed tonight. It took longer than it should have. Plato's help involved a lot of explaining where things were kept and chasing after his efforts with a more thorough pass of a cleaning rag. They still hadn't finished when a bleeping alert from one of Toby 22's consoles caught both their attentions at once. You expecting company? Apart from you? No. Toby 22 made his way to the local scanner array and knitted his robotic facial features into a scowl. What's he doing here? He who? Plato asked predictably. He tried to peek over Toby 22's shoulder. The robot grunted. Charlie 7, that's who. Wide-eyed, Plato shouldered his way to a view of the screen, as if he could see the actual robot himself on it. The Charlie 7? Of course it's the Charlie 7. There'd be no point numbering ourselves if there were more than one of him. You feeling the need for speed by any chance? It's now or never sneaking out before he gets here. Plato shook his head emphatically. Nah, guy's a legend. I mean, 7. That's the one that was the lone survivor, right? The one who got rid of the aliens and populated Earth with robots? Thought you said you didn't want any more robots to know about you. Plato blinked and remembered himself. Right. Dude! Right, I mean, telling him would be just the same as an Earth-wide news blurt. He has been known to keep a secret or two. Plato shook his head. Toby 22 could practically see the wheels turning in that oversized noggin. Nah, I can't meet him. Too risky. But, I would at least like to sneak a peek. You know? See him in the metallic flesh? Toby 22 shooed Plato toward his hydroponics lab. Well, forget it! Charlie 7 is the most savvy robot on the planet. He catches a glimpse of hair or hears a heartbeat, you're busted. You've lost your window to sneak out. Get inside and keep the door shut. And for Darwin's sake, keep quiet. The groundskeeper robot ushered Plato through the door and slammed it shut. Mere seconds later, the visitor's chime rang. Plato crouched beside the greenhouse entrance. With one hand, he shaded his eyes from the brilliant artificial sunlight beaming down from the arched roof. The other hand muffled his breathing. Robots were fully capable of hearing field mice in their burrows, but they generally kept their sensors tuned down to keep annoying audible clutter from distracting them. The same went for optical sensors capable of watching a hummingbird's wings beat. Unless they had a reason to do otherwise, most kept their inputs to near human levels. Out of habit, since, in Plato's experience, most robots still seemed to think they were human. As his breathing slowed, Plato started weighing risks versus rewards. Odds were Charlie 7 was just being a busybody, dropping in on Toby 22 because he was bored. As the only officially retired robot, Plato guessed he'd be more prone to boredom than most. That meant not being on alert, which meant low sensor settings, which led him to think that muffling his breath while on the far side of a well-built door just might be overkill. On the flip side, this was Charlie 7. Even the other robots held him in a weird sort of awe. He'd been there, alone, the only thinking creature on Earth for a period. And he hadn't given up on the planet. Every robot since, and by extension every human, owed him their very existence. Even if the clever bastard was too cozy with the status quo for Plato to risk introducing himself, the draw was undeniable. Edging close, Plato put an ear to the greenhouse door. He listened as Charlie 7 arrived. "Hey, Toby," Charlie 7 greeted him casually, with an incline of his head. The oldest of robots stood at Toby 22's door, clad in a tuxedo rumpled with casual wear. "Mind if I come in?" Without waiting for an answer, Charlie 7 stepped past Toby 22 and into his abode. Not that Toby 22 was going to keep him out. They both knew it. It just felt a trifle inconsiderate not to let the social niceties play out. Then again, what was Charlie 7 if not an exception to every rule, written or otherwise? "What brings you all the way out here?" The framing, he had to admit to himself, was on the weak side. Toby 22 didn't live that far. And at the speeds modern skyroamers flew, veering off course coming and going from his Parisian home would have cost Charlie 7 mere minutes. The door slid shut. "Oh, just checking in on you. Been a lot of self-terminations lately. You know how it is." "It's never a Toby," Toby 22 pointed out. If this was just a wellness check, Charlie 7 must have been going out of his mind with boredom. He trailed after his self-invited guest as the elder robot browsed idly around his home. "True, but I'd hate myself if you were the first." That was a lie, and they both knew it. Charlies were notoriously conceited. Sure, some of the self-terminations had been Charlie's, but they didn't mope around beforehand. You'd never know one was struggling until one day someone discovered an inert chassis. Not like Toby's. In a world of tinkerers and dilettantes, hobbyists and dreamers, Toby's wore sleeves just to roll them up and get work done. All the Jasons and Janets and Marys and Marvins of the world would collectively let Earth fall back to ruin before reducing themselves to the work that Toby's performed. Toby's were humble. Charlie's were anything but. "Come off it, Charlie 7. What's really brought you out here?" "Thoroughness," came the curt, unhelpful reply. "Huh? What's there to be thorough about? I'm thorough enough in my work. I don't need a—" Charlie 7 whirled on him. "Fine. You really want to know? There have been a lot of self-terminations lately. Statistically aberrant, even." He knew he needed a reaction to such an unsurprising revelation, and it couldn't implicate his human guest. "Some psychological trigger? One seeds the idea and anyone considering it just—" "No, I don't think it's anything like that. Look, I've known you half of forever, and I don't suspect you one iota. But there's been evidence." "Evidence?" Toby 22 echoed warily. "Ion trails. Faint. No one who isn't looking for them would ever notice. Heading off from the scene on multiple occasions." Egad, what was Toby 22 going to do? This wasn't some James looking for quarry to hunt, or an Eddie who'd given up when there was no easy answer. This was Charlie 7 in his house, dropping heavy hints of him being a mass murderer. "Plundering research data?" he ventured, knowing the idea sounded lame. "I don't mean to be dumping this on you, but you need to hear it. Those ion trails, they converge. It's not perfect. Someone wasn't so sloppy as to be that precise. But I plotted the ion trails to the point of dispersal, and the lines cross all over England." Toby 22 drew himself up tall. He was a bigger robot than Charlie 7, built rugged for wrangling large herbivores and grumpy carnivores, as well as hauling the equipment for looking after both. "What are you implying here?" "Someone's killing robots, and they're setting you up to be the patsy. Take my advice. Be public. Get seen." "I have so much work to do here." "Slack off. Trade jobs with someone for a few months. Just be—" "Hello? What's this?" Mid-sentence, Charlie 7 stooped to retrieve a kernel of popcorn from the floor. He held it in front of his eyes like a jeweler appraising a diamond. Redenbacher's bow tie. Where did you get a hold of popcorn? The tuxedo-clad Sherlock Holmes began a slow circuit of Toby 22's living space. That impression in the beanbag chair's not your shape. Who do you have over for movie night? Deception algorithms churned through illogical answers until it spit out a viable lie. One of the bears. He's half tame as it is. Charlie 7 cocked a head. What would a bear want to watch? Nothing I've got, sadly, Toby 22 replied, hanging his head. Charlie 7 placed a hand on Toby 22's shoulder. Toby, as a friend, you really need to get out more. Toby 22 waited until the blip of Charlie 7's Skyroamer disappeared from his airspace before allowing himself to relax. He'd made a fool of himself with the bear alibi, but overall, a successful misdirection. That boy was going to be the cause of his deactivation. He just knew it somehow. Since he hadn't come out already on his own, Toby 22 headed to the greenhouse to commend the lad on an uncharacteristic feat of both discretion and self-control. All clear, he announced as he approached the door. When there was no immediate response, an old subroutine kicked in, attempting to anticipate the prank about to befall him. Fresh off an encounter with Charlie 7, Toby 22 was bound to be off balance. An easy target, if he looked at things objectively. Plato, I'm opening the door now. Whatever you've got planned, it's not going to work. I refuse to be surprised. But his assurance didn't draw out a contrite Plato. Steeling himself for whatever playful assault he might soon endure, Toby 22 opened the door to his greenhouse. Row upon row of plant specimens. Variable lighting currently simulating an early afternoon sunshine. Plant-grade genetics equipment. 0 humans. The latter would have been the norm on most occasions of late, and certainly over the course of recent centuries. Presently, he had unreservedly expected 1 human. Exactly 1. No more, no fewer. But Plato was nowhere to be found. A quick retuning of his visual acuity ruled out anywhere in the hydroponics greenhouse as a hiding place. Short of burrowing beneath the soil, the boy was simply too massive to conceal. The obvious answer, unfortunately, lay in the door at the far end of the growing space. It led outdoors. Toby 22 reached the night air just in time to catch a faint whine of an ion engine fading into the distance. Oh, Plato, where are you running off to? Plato hadn't needed to fly far. As much as he had most of the Earth's surface to choose from, he liked the idea of keeping close to Toby 22. Other than the sanctuary, where Plato occasionally brought rescued human experiments, no other robots could be trusted. And while he appreciated the work that Nora 109 did, being around all those helpless human victims unable to care for themselves kept his visits strictly business. Even Nora 109 didn't know about him for certain. He dropped off his evacuees anonymously. No, Toby 22 was his only lifeline. Thus, Plato had chosen a location historically known for hiding out. Sherwood Forest was far from the dark and foreboding cathedral of trees described in books and movies, but there was a forest of sorts. Enough vegetation allowed him to build his hillside lair with camouflage that fit the landscape. A loading ramp opened upward like a garage door. Plato was pretty proud of himself for repurposing the cargo hauler as a home. He'd installed the geothermal generator and drilled the well himself. Burying it and concealing the door had taken longer since the equipment to do it in mere minutes was too tightly tracked by the robots. Shoveling the dirt himself had been the act of a homeowner. He felt connected to the place. Once inside, he heaved a breath of relief. One breath. That's all he allowed. He had a Toby 22 to rescue.
Rock, about time you got back. Spartacus is hungry.
Fine. One breath, feeding his pet parrot, and then he'd get to work solving the problem he'd created. Sorry, pal. Brought you something new to try. Digging in his pocket, he dumped a handful of popcorn on the stainless steel table that doubled as workbench and dinner table. As Spartacus gobbled up his new favorite treat, Plato booted up a terminal and established an anonymous link to the Earthwide. Toby 22 was in trouble, and he didn't even seem to grasp how serious it was. That Charlie 7 was one slick customer. Oh, he feigned friendship. Considering his reputation, nearly every robot on Earth probably considered him a close personal friend. But he was also the only robot who had no official duties, no job, no commitments of any sort. That freed him up to do whatever he pleased, including playing detective. It would have been harmless if the robots really had been ending their own lives. Shame over the failed creatures they'd created instead of humans should have been a good enough reason that no one looked into the matter. Unfortunately, Plato knew better than anyone just how little remorse most of those rogue geneticists felt. Anyone with sufficient insight into aberrant robotic psychology might come to the same realization. These robots were executed. No one else seemed too interested in justice. It had been up to Plato to protect the fledgling human race from its very creators. Recreators. Heck, the robots made the whole situation too confusing to dwell on. What Plato did know included all the pieces for a plan to unravel this particular mess. He had one more name on his list of suspected human cloners before he had to get back to research mode. He knew that Charlie 7 was analyzing ion trails at the sites of the self-terminations. He had access to Toby 22's public schedule. To get Toby 22 off the list of Charlie 7's suspects, all he had to do was find a time when Toby 22 was surrounded by witnesses, sneak into Eddie 91's laboratory, kill Eddie 91, then leave on a different vector. Nothing crazy different, since he didn't want Charlie 7 to guess that Toby 22 might have tipped someone off, but enough to widen the area over which the departure vectors roughly converged. Damn, that had been sloppy of him, heading straight home after every mission. Plato blinked. But he hadn't gone straight home every time. Any time he had a live human test subject and not just a bunch of vials and tissue samples, he took them straight to Noro 109 at the sanctuary on Rapa Nui. Had that omission been due to carelessness? Or had Charlie 7 been fishing for Toby 22 to mention the sanctuary himself? Plato shuddered. All the more reason to off Eddie 91 and get Toby 22 off the hook. It took 2 days for the opportunity to arise, but Plato knew that patience was vital to his survival. Plus, he'd been trying to make himself a set of cutlery, and grinding out the tines of half a dozen forks with an angle grinder was harder than he'd expected. As he set out, Plato lowered the door to his little Sherwood castle and gave it an appraising look. It looked like a natural hillock, nothing out of the ordinary at all. He pulled off the sensor-blocking mesh net one of his victims had invented, revealing his sky roamer, Betty Lou. He didn't know whether the passenger seat would see any use this trip, or if he'd be coming back alone, but he did know that he'd head in the direction of the sanctuary for scientific sins on the way. The controls of Betty Lou felt good in his hands. As the canopy of the two-seater lowered to an airtight seal, he gave a glance in the back. His monopole EMP rifle was right where he'd left it. Another trophy of war, he'd adapted it from equipment invented by another of the human cloners. Though he'd never had the guts to point it at himself and pull the trigger. In theory, it was harmless. To humans. To the robots who treated humans like science experiments, it would set all the ones and zeros in their brains to just zeros. A cleaner death than those monsters deserved. Betty Lou rocketed into the sky on a mission of vengeance and mercy. Siberia was awful. Plato had little else to say about the place. He hadn't dressed for the cold. After all, it was springtime in the northern hemisphere. Lucky for him, Betty Lou was a champ and didn't struggle with the sub-zero weather. As for Plato himself, he had his anger to keep him warm. Eddie 91 had an underground lair that should have set off alarm bells the instant he got committee approval for construction. 8 excavation drones, 2 welding drones, and 8 months of work had carved an underground complex intended for primate genetic research. All that, plus a bunch of equipment allocations, had been readily obtained from the Earthwide, scattered across committee minutes, drone requisition forms, and bills of lading for shipments of everything from multi-pathogen vaccines to supplies of primate nutrient 7. And yet, no gorillas. Either Eddie 91 was just happy to live with his reputation as a miserable hack of a geneticist, or people just weren't paying the least bit of attention to what anyone else worked on, short of a published paper. Most of Plato's time since he'd arrived had been spent painstakingly eliminating all evidence he'd ever been there at all. He'd brushed his tracks out of the snow, jammed the signals that might have alerted Eddie 91 that someone had arrived at his home, deleted security camera footage, erased the logs of those deletions, and mopped up wet footprints he'd left all along the way. Now, Betty Lou was draped with a sensor-resistant net and buried in snow. The jamming signal was quiet, and Plato crouched with his EMP rifle trained on the front door. Hours passed. Plato grew dozy. He nestled against a warm vat and tried to block the nature of its contents from his mind. What felt like seconds later, an echo from a steel door swinging open snapped him awake. He fumbled for his rifle even before seeing what had roused him. He spotted his target through the sight, even though the robot couldn't have been more than 50 meters away. "Eddie 91!" Plato called out. It was a formal challenge on one hand, a last-second check against getting the wrong robot on the other. "A human? Here? Who made you?" the robot demanded. He marched forward. "If this is some kind of sick joke, human, who is your creator?" Whoever this robot was, he was in Eddie 91's home, acting like he owned the place. And he was marching over to Plato, promising a hand-to-hand confrontation that strongly favored the guy made of steel. Plato squeezed the trigger. There came a clack of electromagnetic forces stressing the rifle's firing mechanism suddenly as its supercapacitor discharged. Mid-stride, Eddie 91 froze up. Actuators outside the narrow blast range finished their final command, resulting in an uncoordinated spasm as the inert chassis went down. Everything inside that gleaming steel skull had been factory reset with no hope of recovery. In the hours that followed, Plato discovered to his relief that this had been Eddie 91, and while he hadn't actually succeeded yet, he was trying his damnedest to get in on the arms race to cloning the first successful human. Bile rose in Plato's throat, knowing that the way this subculture of robot kind operated, he wouldn't have fit the bill. That was fine. Plato wasn't perfect. When Charlie 24 had made Plato, he'd been trying to exceed the original humans of Earth. Bigger, stronger, faster, smarter. There was a lot wrong with Plato. His knees were killing him, and his heartbeat never seemed quite right. He was a kid in a man's body, and he knew he'd die of old age someday while he was still young. But he'd burn bright rather than fizzle away, and he'd be the one these robots would regret cloning. Frankenstein's monster was slow, plodding, naive. Charlie 24's monster was none of those. Plato would succeed because he was smart, because he was determined, and because Eddie 91 had left his private computers unencrypted. Plato found a treasure trove of data about the secret society of robots in competition to be the mother or father of the new human era. Correspondence between colleagues included professional courtesies, on-the-sly warnings, mutually secure alibis, and more than a little illicit bartering. The latter was a gold mine. Maybe the other robots in the circle had their terminals locked down better. Maybe they used codes and code names and paranoid levels of subterfuge. But not Eddie 91. He left the door open and the horses ran free. Sadly, most of his friends had already fallen victim to Plato's EMP-centric justice. But he got one new name. Evelyn 38. Plato had never heard of her. Eddie 91 certainly had. One robot's arrogance was about to be another's undoing. Eddie 91 had left the keys to his kingdom lying around, and Plato used them to get into every system, every database the filthy geneticist kept. Oh, he might have been cagey about it, but he knew these other robots personally and didn't fully anonymize his voluminous records. Plato had access to transaction histories, social meetings, and the occasional sharing of work in progress. It was enough to show that Eddie 91 couldn't produce a viable embryo, while Evelyn 38 had been successfully birthing vat-grown humans for decades. Decades. And none had shown up at the sanctuary. Either she had a hidden colony of humans underground somewhere, or she was disposing of them herself. Plato wondered if, for the first time, he might meet humans who were older than him. He didn't know whether he could handle it, because what he saw in the limited correspondence on the matter, Evelyn 38 treated her humans abysmally. That was no excuse. Not for a hero. Plato downloaded all the data he could load on his portable computer, then spent hours painstakingly erasing any traces of his presence. He left Eddie 91's chassis with its head bridging the current between two high-voltage transformers. Whatever robots discovered him, they'd debate whether his death was intentional or merely a careless accident. None of them would suspect Plato. Not even the legendary Charlie 7. Only Toby 22 would figure it out, and he knew enough to keep his vocal modulator shut. There was no time to lose. Plato left in the middle of a snowstorm that would soon obscure any trace of Betty Lou's hiding place. He'd come with a mission to throw off any trails leading to Toby 22. He left with a mission to take down the worst cloner he'd come across yet, Evelyn 38. Plato plotted a course for Rome. Thanks for listening to this Project Transhuman book. To continue listening, search Project Transhuman at your favorite audiobook store, or visit projecttranshuman.com. This has been Plato's Cave, a Project Transhuman short story, written by J.S. Morin, narrated by Michael Naramore. Copyright 2023 by J.S. Morin. Production copyright 2023 by J.S. Morin.